Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I'm of course Josh Bycer, and we have another great developer cast lined up this week. My guest is the co-founder and developer at Wormwood Studios, who is currently working on a new point-and-click adventure game, Strangeland. And this has been a long development process, and he is on to talk about it, as well as, of course, some good old adventure game design discussions, as we certainly have plenty of them here on this channel. So, please welcome to the cast, Mark Yohalem, and hopefully I didn't butcher your last name too badly there.
Close, Yohalem.
Yohalem.
Thank you for having me on. And I will say there's like about a 10% of the time someone gets the name right. So you're in
Yeah,
good company.
I'm terribly
So,
sorry.
well, anyway, thanks for having me on. And I look forward to talking about Strangeland and adventure games more generally.
Awesome. So, there is certainly a lot to talk about here, and since this is your first time on the cast, Mark, I always like to ask developers, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what your background is? And then, of course, for people listening, what is Strangeland?
Sure. So I am a lawyer by day and a game designer by night. I've been making games in one form or another since I was, I don't know, so for 30 plus years. When I was a kid, my grandfather, who was a NASA engineer, felt that my brother and I needed to learn how to use computers. So he got us an Apple IIc, which we ran through a black and white television, and he showed us how to halt the startup process, and then you could just program straight into it in basic. And so basically, no pun intended, from, I don't know, I think I was somewhere between 7, 9, I don't know, somewhere around there, started programming games. And then as I got older, I shifted more into exclusively a designer role. And I do like a tiny bit of programming now, but mostly just design.
Okay. And for people listening to us, what is Strangeland?
Strangeland is a point and click adventure game inspired by sort of the classic adventure games of the 1990s: Sierra, LucasArts, Westwood, Revolution. And its subgenre, or the genre of the narrative, I would say, is psychological horror. Maybe a little bit less horrific than a lot of the kind of jump scare, grotesque horror that you typically see on a PC game. It's not as grotesque as, say, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is a great classic point and click adventure. We're not quite that grotesque, but it's a horror game.
Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at the website for it, and I see that it was inspired or is the spiritual sequel to another game, Primordia.
Primordia was our first adventure game,
Okay.
which we released. Now I'm blanking. 2012, I think. Which is a similar retro point and click adventure game. It's a that one is a post-apocalyptic setting with robots. Um, and it turned out we had initially planned it. The artist Victor Flug, the programmer James Spanos, and I had originally thought it was just going to be a small freeware game. And then over time, it grew and grew and grew. And finally, we asked Wajidai Games to publish it. And it's been quite successful. It's sold about 250,000 copies. And it's consistently one of the highest rated adventure games on Steam, something that never ceases to amaze me. Because, having made it, I just see the flaws in it. And that's sort of my psychological nature. But anyway, it's cheap. People should try it if they haven't yet. Um, and yeah, so strangely, is a spiritual successor in the sense that, um, well, they're both traditional point and click adventure games made by us. But second, I think both of them really have quite a bit of thematic depth to them. And even though the themes are fairly different between the two games, I think the approach is quite similar, the approach that we took in creating them. And so, obviously, if you love robots but hate horror, there's a reasonable likelihood that you will like Primordia but not like Strangeland. If you hate robots but you love horror, then vice versa. But I think for sort of the ordinary player, if you liked one, you'll probably like the other.
Right. And I just finished writing my fourth book about horror genre, so I am certainly all keyed up for another chat about horror as well with you.
Okay.
So,
You probably know a lot more than I do about the genre.
so I guess my first question for you, Martin, this is something I asked Dave and a few of the other adventure game developers I've spoken with. What attracted you to the point-click adventure genre, like originally, to make a Primordia and obviously Strangeland in?
Well, when I was in sixth grade, I fell in love with the genre when I played Loom, a LucasArts game. It's a very beautiful game, and the everything about it was really elegant. It had this cool manual. There was a little audio cassette that set up the world, and then the game's visuals are beautiful. The game's themes are beautiful. The interface is really elegant, and after playing it, I was just really enraptured by the genre. I had played some of the parser-based Sierra games like King's Quest 1 and 2, and had sort of bounced off them a little bit, but Loom really, really grabbed me. And so from age 12 to 32, making an adventure game was one of my goals. We finally achieved it with Primordia. Um, but it was just something I always knew that I wanted to do. I took many tries at it, and generally did not finish the games. Um, that's sort of one explanation for why, is just saw it, loved it, wanted to do it myself. I think more generally, there is a kind of story that you can tell with point and click adventure games. You almost have to tell with point and click adventure games, which is different from the kind of story you tell with other games. So if you're doing a role playing game, if you're doing a action game, uh, like there has you sort of violence has to be at the center of the narrative. And that's fine. I enjoy role playing games. I enjoy shooting games, but I've always liked that adventure games, the narratives are tend to be more about clever outsiders. They're sort of somewhere in the Loki, Anansi, trickster vein. Um, some of them are also bumbling, I don't know, Inspector Gadget types, but it's never, action hero is sort of an exception to the rule. You've got Full Throttle or Gemini Rue. There are a couple of games like that, but generally it's like this outsider who's very clever and or at least is controlled by a player who's very clever. And I don't know. I was drawn to those stories. Being kind of an outsider as a kid, like it was a nice thing to see a protagonist like that in a game. Um, and so I don't know. It's an interesting challenge to tell that story. In some ways, it's easier in a video game to tell a story about killing space demons or something. But um, anyway, so yeah, I think those are two factors. Saw it, wanted to make it, and then wanted to tell this kind of a story.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that I found very interesting about the point click genre, something that I brought up with the other developers, I want to get your thoughts on, is that it does seem like the genre it's gone through like several like renaissance periods since the 90s. I again like for probably for the people listening to us right now, they remember of course like kind of like the golden age, like the mid 90s, LucasArts, Maniac Mansion, you mentioned Full Throttle earlier. Then we kind of entered the early thousands when it just became very insular, when kind of like the more I think like I think I've heard the term like more like European adventure games, like the very puzzle heavy, good luck solving this without guide period came along. And then we kind of entered more into kind of like where we're at now, where a lot more of the adventure games are more kind of story and character driven, with kind of the puzzle solving and the gameplay almost like second or third tier down. And I spoke with Dave about this, of course, with Waggying, especially with like how much his games have evolved over the last decade. And what I want to ask you about, Mark, is like, what are your thoughts as both a fan and a developer of the genre, like, on what is the state of the adventure game genre today for you?
So this is like a lawyerly answer. I will answer that question first, and then I want to also talk about puzzles as a separate topic because the two are related.
Oh
But
yes.
so let me first say, yeah, the genre. I mean, I don't know, Renaissance is the right term. There was a time when the adventure game genre was the most lucrative game genre, right? When Sierra was making its games back in the 80s and 90s, my understanding is that they were like the top selling computer game. Eventually like Doom comes along and supplants it. But there was really a time where these were not like a subgenre with its own like narrow aficionados. This really was the heartland of computer games. And if you look at the production values of a game like King's Quest VI, you know, actually there are independent adventure games today that compare very favorably. But at the time, this was like a huge budget, really cutting edge audio visuals, cutting edge interface. And so, from the perspective of looking back, what we sort of think of it as, the golden age of a small niche genre, when in reality it was like the golden age of the empire, right? And now
Mm-hmm.
we just have our little rump city state that's left over. And then there was like the Telltale era, right? Telltale, in a sense, really again occupied a big market share, although nothing like Sierra's. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's now gone. So I think now it really is a very tiny sector of the market. Lots of people play adventure games, maybe more people than played it in the 90s, which is like an interesting fact about just the expansion of access to computer games. So, like, I think at one point I looked at the sales figures that the LucasArts games had in the golden age, and they're smaller than the sales figures that Watched Eye Games has had in the last 10 years. In other words, more people are buying, Primordia, Unavowed, Gemini Rue, than we're buying Monkey Island 2, Loom, back when those were out. But, on the other hand, now like a bajillion people are buying computer games, and back then it was a smaller number. So, the consequence of this is that I don't know. Like there is an inward-looking quality to game design, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
all rather than a lot of like pushing this as the cutting edge of uh, game development. There is a certain degree to which we are trying to recapture a lost era,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think people have different views on that, but I do think that is a big change that. Um, I think the idea of an adventure game really revolutionizing gameplay, um, I'm not sure it would happen now. I mean, I'm not sure what it would look like. In some ways, I guess, and this is a very long answer. In some ways, adventure games won the war, right? So adventure games were completely destroyed as a pole position genre, but some of the qualities of adventure games, the narrative qualities, the presentational qualities, ended up suffusing other genres. So we now have like a genre that's called action adventures. They bear almost no resemblance from a game design standpoint to what we called adventures when I was a kid. But from a presentational standpoint, your Uncharted or whatever is actually very similar to adventure games of my childhood in that there's a well-defined protagonist, there are cutscenes, there's high quality audio visuals, whatever it is. And so in that sense, maybe like the most effective mass market elements of adventure gaming have persisted everywhere and have just like evolved past the point and click mechanics. And so what you're left is like there's now just this tiny rump, as I say, of the point and click mechanics. Now I think those mechanics are great. So at some point I want to talk about puzzles and why I think they're good. But that's my big picture, is that like in some ways adventure games are everywhere, and then in some ways the traditional adventure game is now just a very small subgenre.
Yeah. And it is, I think, very interesting about how much, the state of the market has changed. Like, I've spoken with a few other adventure game developers. I think it was Corey and Lori Cole, who did, of course, the Quest for Glory series back in the day. And I remember during our conversation, they spoke about, like, how much harder it is to get, like, new people to play point-and-click adventure games. And I think part of it is, I think, is what you just said, is that kind of the genre qualifiers have really kind of been like lifted and adapted by other genres. Like you mentioned, of course, Uncharted. Like the last 15 years, I think, has been a really big push for kind of the cinematic side of the game industry. Every like AAA game these days, it's not just an action. We have a well developed plot. Everything from The Last of Us to God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn. Like, just pick any AAA game that was released in the last 5 years, and chances are there's a full budget, plotted story that goes with it. And it does feel like it's a lot harder to kind of go back to that point and click design, at least for new fans. And it's something that I've had discussions with other developers about, just in terms of like where the market for point and click adventure games is. Like, is it sticking with, the old school fans who grew up with the games you mentioned? Or are we seeing people who've never touched or have no idea what, a Sierra game is? Are they able to, sit down and enjoy these games?
So, I see reviews on Steam for Primordia where people say it's the first point and click adventure they've ever played, and now they're in love with the genre. I find that sort of hard to believe. I mean, I believe it. I don't think people are lying, but I find it hard to believe in the sense that if someone just thought like, "Gee, I really want to play a point and click adventure game," that just try it, right? I want to try the genre out. That Primordia would be the entry point. Seems sort of random to me. I mean, I guess if you put enough people around a building, someone will go in through every door. So, Primordia is the door for 5 people or 500 people, and Monkey Island 2 is the door for 500,000 people. But I, so I guess I would say um, there are new people playing it. Like my kids play adventure games. They didn't grow up playing adventure games in the 90s. They weren't alive in the 90s. They're obviously biased since their dad makes adventure games. But I think there are other people who come to the genre new. And then I think there are people who didn't play the adventure games in the 90s, but did play them sometime in the past, right? Maybe they played them in 2005 when Good Old Games got started. When I can't remember when Good Old Games got started, but they had heard about the 90s point and clicks, and so they went on and played them for the first time substantially after their release, but substantially before present day. So I think there is like a wide age gradient. I mean, I got an email once from someone who was in his 70s and said he had played Primordia and really enjoyed it and been playing adventure games for whatever it was, 35 years, 40 years. But I think there are some new players too. I think there is a challenge. So this is one of my theories for the problem with puzzles in adventure games, the difficulty with implementing puzzles, is that there is a generational difference. I don't want to overstate generational differences, but I look at my kids and myself and how we came to use computers. So as I said at the start, for me, it was my grandfather got us this Apple IIc, and my first introduction was hanging this keyboard, which was integrated with the CPU, and figuring out quick basic or quick. It was basic, I guess, not quick basic, and playing games that used a keyboard, whatever it was, and finicky things like hole punching your floppy disk to double its storage space, or figuring out these kinds of technological challenges just to play a game. And if you go to like the 90s, it was like figuring out IRQ and DMA settings to get your sound blaster to work, freeing up enough base memory to get a
Oh
game
god.
to run, and changing your auto exec.bat to get it, free up some extra memory at the start, things like that. So my kids have no idea about that, right? Their entry point to computers was like an iPad touchscreen, and they're used to interfaces that are not puzzles, right? They're sort of an extension of natural human um, interaction. It's amazing to see a young child pick up an iPad or something that they don't have. No one has to tell you how to use an iPad. They just figure it out. Um, and if you take this sort of like experience of growing up, uh, adventure game puzzles from the classic era are all sort of like fiddling with IRQ and DMA settings, right? They're often very finicky. You have to be very, attentive to every little thing.
Yep.
Um, Failure, you have catastrophic failures, which was also an experience with computers as a child, right? Like, you could end up having your hard drive formatted because you screwed something up, or you could permanently corrupt your memory, or whatever it was. There were like bad things that could happen on a computer. And so like there was just a different expectation that by the time one was able to run King's Quest 3, she or he like was going to be able to survive that game. Whereas today, if you get to play King's Quest 3 on like a scum VM, on a Windows 10 machine or something, there's no reason to expect that the person who got to that point is already like battle hardened by technology itself to be ready to play it. And so, I think there's just going to be inherently a lower tolerance for the fiddliness, the finickiness, the sort of whimsical cruelty of those older games. And so there, as a result, as a designer, there's like a big pressure to just not have that stuff because some significant percentage of your player base just doesn't want it. And so isn't it better just to take it out? So that, I think that's part of what has driven the push away from old school puzzles in adventure games. Anyway.
And it is, I think, a tough balance for a lot of developers, kind of like a weave between. Because there are people who do like those puzzles, who really like, sit down and, just kind of like work it out. Oh, excuse me. Oh, voice is cutting out there. Okay, there you go. But as I was saying, there are people who do like those very brain melty puzzles. And when they work, they can be a very unique, form of gameplay for it. But like you said, and again, like for a lot of people I've spoken with, it is also very fiddly. It's something very hard to go back to if you never experienced it originally. Like for myself, I can't play old school like CRPGs like the Wizardry series, Might and Magic, because I don't have that background. I don't have that love of that kind of design from the late 80s, early 90s.
You have to graph paper out and start drawing where the spinners are.
Mm-hmm. And it is, I think, a tough balance for developers today because on one hand, I've had a few conversations about this. On one hand, the adventure genre is very hardened in terms of what are the design qualifiers of it. Like, you can't exactly put in a FPS section or, high stakes gambling portion into your games. But on the same token, you still need to look at it through the lens of somebody new. Somebody who didn't grow up playing Maniac Mansion or Loom or, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. And it's something I think even a lot of like kind of modern retro developers have struggled with. I've spoken with the developers of they're making like kind of modern retro Apple inspired RPGs like the Apple II computer. Mark
Yeah.
Radosi and I can't remember the other one that I've spoken with.
This
And
is like Nox Archaeist or
yeah, that was
whatever.
his game. And there was another one, and the name is Scold. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah.
And like during those conversations, they spoke about how they want to design a game that somebody who owns an Apple II will fully know and love. But in the same breath, they also understand they need to make this game so that somebody who has no idea what this is, they can still actually play and enjoy it because the larger market is definitely far greater than just, RPG Apple II lovers. And I feel like the Avengers genre is in that same position where you have to make it, in that same style, but you also need to look at, as you said, you have to avoid the fiddly bits, those parts that, really haven't aged well.
Yeah. So I should say of the um, sort of retro point and click developers, I think we are strongly at the pro puzzle end of the spectrum. I'm sure there are people beyond us. There's always someone farther down whatever spectrum one is on. But yeah, so I guess I should say I see all of the reasons for not putting hard puzzles into adventure games. The ones that you mentioned, they're just difficult to design, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it is a development cost. It's not an out of pocket development cost, but like it is a cost. It takes time. It takes thought that could otherwise go to other aspects of it. It turns off some players. It turns off a lot of reviewers because there's nothing worse than you've got someone who's doing a professional game review of your game. They get stuck, right? The message of being stuck in an adventure game is the game is telling you you suck,
Yeah.
right? You're stupid. You can't figure it out. And if someone says that to you, if a game says that to you, there's an instinctive reaction of like, no, you're the one who sucks, right? You're the one who's being totally obtuse. And so, it just, in that sense, puzzles and adventure games are just like a drag anchor that, it's, so there are all these arguments against it. But to me, it, it is an essential element of the genre. And there is a transcendent quality of adventure game puzzles that I wouldn't give up. So yeah, this is now I can sort of do this by heart because I've said this and we just posted a dev diary for Strangeland about this, and I've given this speech many times. But basically, people criticize adventure games for having what they call moon logic. Moon logic is a puzzle that doesn't adhere to normal logic. This
Mm-hmm.
is like, use the monkey on the bolt because it's actually a monkey wrench, haha, and that's how you loosen the bolt in Monkey Island 2. Um, so, people, moon logic is the term that's used to criticize that. And it is absolutely true. Actually, no adventure game that I know of follows formal logic in the, philosophical meaning of formal logic. There's actually like symbols that one does for formal logic. What people generally mean is that a puzzle is logical if you can understand the rules and then the puzzle follows the rules. And for any puzzle, some players won't understand the rules and some people will. Basically, it's an active communication and everyone communicates a little differently. And you can have miscommunications and those miscommunications get frustrating for a player because they think they're hearing something from you that's not what you're saying. They're saying something back to the game that the game is misinterpreting. And there's just, like any other thing where there's a miscommunication, everyone gets frustrated. But uh, there are these moments when you actually succeed in communicating. And this happens in every adventure game, right? Every adventure game that anyone has ever completed a puzzle in that was not like the most rudimentary, there's a sign that says use your rope here and you use the rope and you solve the puzzle. Something where there's actually lateral thinking, inductive reasoning, whatever it is involved, deductive reasoning, whatever it is involved in passing this obstacle. Anytime that happens, there actually is a successful moment of communication between the player and the game, between the player and the designer. And the very nature of eccentric adventure game puzzles is that that moment of communication is like is amazing, right? Someone, it's like, you're speaking in code. Someone has been speaking to you in code, and suddenly you get the code and you're able to speak back to the person in code. That's like a great moment in a game. It's a great moment in like a you know physical game you might play in the real world. It's a great moment when you're learning a foreign language. That first moment when you're able to read a story or a book in a foreign language, or watch a film, or listen to a song, or have a conversation. And I think adventure games have that moment. And so, I say it is moon logic, right? But then there's this there's this moment where you're talking to the man on the moon, right? And it's like, oh, it's amazing. And then you realize, like, you're also talking with all the other people all around the earth who have solved this puzzle. It's a community of communication that all of you figured out. I have to use a monkey on the bolt to loosen the bolt, right? That was this crazy moment where it turns out that I am able to get my brain moving on the same wavelength as Ron Gilbert or whatever, and moving also on the same wavelength as 100,000 other people on the planet. And that's a really cool moment of bridge building that can only happen with puzzles. It doesn't happen when it's just like a telltale sort of click to continue kind of adventure game. That's really a more passive experience. There isn't the same communicative dimension, I don't think.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I would, you have to have puzzles in mind.
And I think that's kind of like where like the division of like kind of modern adventure game design has really come down to is, the more passive it's a, it's more like you're watching an interactive story or interactive novel kind of approach, like with Telltale and like that kind of story driven side. And then the kind of, as you said, like, here's a puzzle, and if you can't solve it, you're going to have to keep trying to solve it. Like, you're that interactivity. And
Right.
it is, I think, very hard for a lot of developers, I think a lot of consumers, to tread that line. Because I've played adventure games on both sides of that spectrum. I've played the entirely story driven ones, and sometimes I just get really bored when it's just, here, just click over here, watch all this. Okay, now click over here and watch all this. Like, there's no real greater thought to it. But then conversely, I play those adventure games where it's like, here's a puzzle, and you're going to have to figure out 27 different things in order to solve it. Oh, you can't figure out? Well, we're not going to give you any hints to it, and, you're done, basically, at that point.
Yeah. So, we address that. We have multiple solutions to most of the puzzles in the game.
Mm-hmm.
We have an integrated hint system in the game. And then also, aside, so that's like an in-character hint system. You can call for a hint to a sort of antagonist character. And then also, when you do something wrong, this is fairly standard for adventures, that the message that you get when you do something wrong is designed to sort of gently nudge you in the right
Mm-hmm.
direction, right? So, you know, you try to cut through something with a dull hatchet, and the game says it's not sharp enough, right? So that's a nudge that you need to sharpen, the hatchet or whatever it is. And then uh, a good adventure game has enough of those nudges, but the reality is you can never have quite enough. I mean, there's no adventure game I've ever played that has actual puzzles where I've not gotten stuck, because there's always something. The sort of like ex- classic example of this, I think the best designed area of an adventure game is the first town in Monkey Island 2, Woodtick it's called. I think it's just like a masterpiece of design. But both when I played it as a kid and then when I played it as an adult with my kids, I missed both times. There's like a porthole on the side of a ship that you can swing into, and it gives you access to a kitchen where you need to go in there to solve various puzzles. The porthole is all lit up, and it's a not like one pixel. It's probably 12 pixels by 12 pixels on a low resolution mode and 50 by 50 on high resolution. There's light shining out of it. It's animated. There's no reason to think a player would miss it, but I have missed it both times playing both versions of the game. Both times playing with someone else, as a kid with a friend and as an adult with my kids. It just happens that I always miss that spot. And, as a designer, it's hard to know what's going to be your porthole that, whatever your player equivalent of me is misses that. And if you don't know what it is, you can't nudge people towards it.
Yeah, like for me, like I cannot do any musical based puzzle. Like if it's anything about reading music, paying attention to like beats and notes, those puzzles are just beyond me. I think there was one in what was the name of that game? Sanitarium. The that classic like very like kind of horror or very like creepy adventure game. And
I had to cheat on that same puzzle.
oh yeah,
I'm toned down, so it's just
me
it's a
too.
non-starter.
Yeah, and that I think is another really interesting point. I think it goes back to what you were just saying regarding like hint systems, like having an integrated hint system, having the game kind of respond to the player. Because I'm sure for you, and I'm sure for the people listening to us, like we've all played like the one adventure game where it's like there's no feedback. It's like, okay, I want to use the monkey wrench. It doesn't work. I want to use the pot of glue. Doesn't work. I want to use my permanent marker. Doesn't work. Okay, so what can I use? The game tells you nothing about it. Just keep going through the inventory. I think that is the scar of adventure game players is that one time you just have to go through your entire inventory and just go, oh, I'm going to use this on the door. No. I'm going to use this on the door. No. And just repeat it for every puzzle.
Yeah, and so I think this is, you're right. It is inherent to the system that sometimes that will happen. I also think to some degree, like adventure game developers, like suffered a self-inflicted wound here,
Mm-hmm.
which is, you know, that was like a legitimate criticism of some adventure game puzzles, but it really wasn't all adventure game puzzles back in the day. We all have some we can think of, but most adventure game puzzles, even in hard games, I solved on my own as a child. They were not all impossible, use every item on every hotspot. But I think it was the Old Man Murray site had this article, "What Killed Adventure Games? They Killed Themselves," and it
Mm-hmm.
made fun of Gabriel Knight 3's cat fur mustache puzzle.
That puzzle
And
is.
then
I just want to stop and say that puzzle has been brought up, I think, with every like developer interview that I've had with an adventure game developer. Like it's become the standard example.
because that article had
Mm-hmm.
such a significant impact that it became sort of accepted wisdom that that puzzle was, like a synecdoche for the whole genre, and that's what adventure game puzzles were like. But it really was not, right? That's a puzzle that stood out because it was so absurd, and apparently was not Jane Jensen's design. It was like something that got put in subsequent to her involvement on the project. There's some backstory to it
Mm-hmm.
that exculpates her, but you know everyone just started talking about adventure games as if that's what they were, right? They were always pixel hunting. They were always moon logic. They were always use every item on every hotspot. And players really internalize that, right? So now players just think if you're stuck, the thing you should do is just start spamming items.
Mm-hmm.
Even when often, you know, it doesn't make any sense. Like there actually is, if you took a second and thought about it, you would say, okay, at least I can winnow the list down to like these 3 items on these 2 hotspots. But like, it's become like a reflex that, um, in the same way that resting and then casting every buff spell before a fight in a, you know, isometric role-playing game is like everyone knows if you are not good at the combat system, the game still lets you rest everywhere. Just rest and buff your character with everything and you'll be fine. And it's not fun to do that, right? It's
Yeah.
really tedious to cast all of those blast and haste and iron or stone skin, whatever all the spells are called. It stinks, but everyone there's sort of like well, that's expected of you. And I think the same mentality got sort of going in adventure game puzzles. That if a puzzle was hard, it was bad. And since it's
Mm,
bad, you should just take it out, or at least make it easy enough that you can skip past it. But the really good puzzles, to me, are so integrated into the game
mm-hmm.
that the puzzle expresses the setting and the solution to the puzzle expresses the protagonist.
Yeah.
So, the good puzzle is the one that says, like, tells you something. Even in Monkey Island, right? The zaniness of the puzzles tells you something about the setting and the approach that Guybrush takes to solving them, right? It's not a swashbuckling, cool pirate solution. Like, it's an expression of Guybrush being a dweeb. That the way he would solve something is a totally ridiculous way, rather than a sort of frontal assault, the
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing that you might do in Full Throttle. Um, and so, to me, that's, with Primordia, we tried to, they were not perfect, right? They're puzzles that aren't good, but I think a lot of the puzzles, really are designed to convey this sense of a decaying post-apocalyptic world. And then the way you solve those puzzles are expressive of the main character, Horatio, being a scavenger, and sort of aspiring to being a non-violent scavenger. He's, has this background of being a war machine that he's trying to get beyond. And so, you couldn't, I mean, you could do that just by expository dialogue or by cutscenes, but it's so much more powerful when you're able to define these things through the gameplay, because then the player like is himself or herself kind of expressing the character through what he or she does in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates this unity between the player and character that you don't get through expository dialogue or cutscenes, where it's just the game controlling the character.
Yeah, and I think what you said there is a really good point about having the puzzle match, the mentality or the personality of your protagonist. And I think that's a really solid way of kind of designing or getting around, as we said, like that moon logic. That if the logic fits the world itself and the player understands the world, then you can have these very fantastical and crazy puzzles if the world is fantastical and crazy as well. Like, if you're in a fantasy world and the puzzle solution is just a Towers of Hanoi or, tic tac toe, what does that have to do with this world? But if everything kind of fits, it does make things work better. Like Sam and Max, the series from Telltale, before they kind of switch over to the Walking Dead style. I thought that did a really good job of, you're playing as two wacky characters, so of course the solutions are going to be wacky. You think Sam is going to come with like a very simple solution to this stuff, and it reminds me like as like the opposite of that was from the Seventh Guest, the classic adventure game that I played this I think last year, and I got stuck at this chess puzzle, and I was like, "What the hell am I even doing in this?" And like after the stream was over, like a friend sent me like a 5-page like short story of how the solution was as supposed to work. I'm like, that doesn't even involve chess. Like, how the hell was I supposed to figure this out?
Yeah. I mean, Seventh Guest, I would query whether it's actually an adventure game or whether it's just a puzzle game with cinema. So, to me, an adventure game has puzzles and has narrative, but the puzzles and narrative have to be complementary.
Mm-hmm.
The narrative has to set up puzzles, and the puzzles have to express the narrative. Seventh Guest, I mean, you could really reskin Seventh Guest in any number of other settings, right? You could have it be a rendezvous with Rama, you're on an alien spaceship, and then replace all the iconography with, alien symbols. And it would be no better or worse, in my view, right? It would just be different. But you wouldn't say, oh, now this puzzle with spiders that instead has alien spiders, whatever, is like, that no longer makes sense, because the puzzles never actually had any inherent connection to like a horror toy factory. That was just sort of a pretext for, as you say, what amount to Tower of Hanoi, Tic Tac Toe, just sort of logic game puzzles. Um, anyway, so I guess I'd say that with respect to someone's guest, and then to me, the one of the most um, frustrating examples. So the Gabriel Knight 3 puzzle is a good example of this, right? That is a puzzle that if it had been in Space Quest, I don't think anyone would remember the puzzle today
Mm-hmm.
because it would seem totally consistent with Space Quest's mix of, you know, tactile things that actually do kind of exist with preposterous implementation of them. It is not quite Sam and Max level absurd game, but it is an absurd game, right? You lasso the Energizer Bunny and steal its battery in Space Quest 4, for example. Um, so but what made that puzzle offensive, memorably offensive, is that the setting is so serious and the tone is so serious that
Mm-hmm.
the idea of like within the context of a nominally grounded, realistic game, you are doing something that only would make sense in a Animaniacs cartoon
Mm-hmm.
is like a rupture of the that relationship between the puzzles and the setting. I think the longest journey, frankly, has issues in this regard as
Mm-hmm.
well. That I would say in the dissenting view, I don't think it's a great game. I think has a lot of beautiful elements to it, but I'm not a huge fan. But one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan is that the puzzles to me don't feel like they are expressive of the protagonist or the setting, right? Like it does. The first puzzle in the game is like you take an heirloom ring that's one of your character. Your character is like this bohemian artist student, who doesn't have a lot of possessions in the world, but she has an heirloom ring, and she puts the heirloom ring into a blown fuse so that the gold in the ring can conduct the electricity to solve a blown fuse puzzle. It's like I mean, okay, there's a character who would do that. That character is like a terrible human being, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
that's not the character that we're shown, right? The character that we're shown is sort of a thoughtful, humanistic character who is then relating to puzzles like a lunatic, or I don't know, someone who has no
Mm-hmm.
sociopath or something with no emotional connection at all.
Mm-hmm. And what you just described of the sociopath adventure game protagonist, that's another thing that we have certainly spoken with a lot about. And yeah, it is a really good point about how much, again, like the character and the character in the world have to be in sync, I think, for these puzzles to make sense. And I'm trying to think of some other like notable examples from some of the games that I've played. And it's something like a term that I like to use is an organic puzzle. When I talk about like in a lot of like action adventure games where it's not, you're stopping to, solve a tic tac toe or complete a crossword. Is that as we said, the puzzle is built into the world and the solution comes from that character. And like we're saying this very easily, but it is a lot harder in practice when you have to build these puzzles that make sense within this space.
Yeah, so I mean, this is, I think, one reason. Another reason why puzzles have come out of adventure games is
Mm-hmm.
that increasingly there is a desire to tell traditional hero stories through adventure games,
Mm-hmm.
right? In general, like there always have been traditional hero stories in video games, but I think as they've gotten more cinematic, there's even more of a desire to tell, you know, I mean, they may be richer hero stories, but something that would feel like a Hollywood summer movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even if it's not an action game, then you want to tell a story that's like a thoughtful art house movie, but it still has this desire to tell certain kinds of stories that just don't fit well with the imperatives of the adventure game genre.
Mhm.
So, Full Throttle, I think, pulls it off to a pretty good degree, but it's really difficult to tell a story like, uh, you know, I don't know, Uncharted, right?
Mhm.
Uncharted through a adventure game. Even if you look at the Indiana Jones adventure games, those I think are quite good, but they had to have this fighting mini game first of all,
Mhm.
and second, even with that, they are missing some of the spirit of the movies, right? There isn't the same breathlessness, the same sense of sort of dynamism that the movies have because the pace of an adventure game is a little bit slower. And,
Mhm.
you know, uh, I think the problem is if you want to tell a story about, um, I sometimes I pick on Gemini Rue a little bit in this regard because it's so
Mhm.
successful that I feel like it's fine. The game is
Mhm.
sold hundreds of thousands of copies, thousands of people love the game, but to me, there is like a irreconcilable difference between the character you're playing and the actions you can take as that character. So you are nominally named Asriel Odin, right? It doesn't sort of get more um, anime superhero than that. And you are a mercenary, retired soldier wearing a trench coat, armed with a gun, on a world that rains all the time. And you're like carrying out a mission for your handler. And so it's just like, okay, I know how this story goes. This story goes like I get to like hold people up at gunpoint and like kick down doors and get in shootouts and stuff. But then the first puzzle in the game is you go into an apartment complex and ask the doorman like what room number someone has in the apartment complex. And then the doorman is just like, I'm not going to tell you. And you're like, can you please will you tell me? I'm not going to tell you. And that's just it. You can't intimidate him. You can't pistol whip him. Like it's just your character reacts exactly as if he were, Guybrush Threepwood, Roger Wilco, any other adventure game protagonist who is like a dweeb who gets, constantly people bully him and talk down to him. But it's not. That's not the character you're playing, right? And then you go up. You finally get into the apartment, and there's like you're in the apartment. It's dark. There's a dead body on the ground. It's like, okay, the mood is finally like hitting. This is going to be awesome. There's a bang on the door, and you realize it's the bad guys are at the door. And I've got this gun. It's a dark apartment. I'm like, oh, I know how this story goes. This goes like I hide in the corner, and when they burst in, like I take, hold them at gunpoint and find out who their boss is. No, that doesn't work. If you stay in the room, you instantly die. The correct solution is like through various hijinks, you leave and then you climb up the building and solve various puzzles, and and it's just again, it's like, well, that's fine if you're Roger Wilco. Of course, he has to run away from the Terminator robot and
Mhm.
Space Quest. But like that's not the character here. And there's this tension where I think as designers we often want to tell a story about a man of action, a woman of action, whatever it is. Um, as players, it's sort of fun to have that feeling of playing as Raziel or playing as the Doom Marine or whoever it
Mhm.
is. But in adventure games, you end up that's not the character you get to play. That's not the character you have to write. Um, and anyway, so the result is, I think, sometimes you see the telltale approach, right? The telltale approach is we're just going to tell the story about Raziel, right? And the way we're going to do it is that when you get to the place where otherwise there would be a puzzle in a real adventure game, there will be a quick time event. And in that quick time event, you'll hit certain buttons and do something really awesome. And that way we can have you play an awesome protagonist, even though it's not an action game. But to me, in doing that, you've like alienated the player from the character because
Mhm.
the player doesn't really feel in a quick time event like he's in control. At least I've never felt that way. Not
Yeah.
since, Dragon's Lair back on the old arcade systems to the present. To me, that just feels like I'm doing something divorced from the character. And to go back to what I said before, it's not like after a quick time event, I feel like some moment of communing with the designer. I just feel like I'm, a monkey pressing buttons to get a reward from the
Mhm.
slot. So anyway, so this is, I think, very long. I can't even remember the question I was answering, but I think this is a reason why you don't get these organic solutions. You don't get organic puzzles. What you get are puzzles that are um, you have a story, right? You have a story that calls for action, a story that calls for diplomacy, a story that calls for seduction, a story that calls for introspection. There's no way to translate those things into good adventure game gameplay. And
Mhm.
so you sort of have a story about, you know, introspection, and suddenly you have to figure out to use a monkey on a bolt, because we don't have a verb for introspect that is going to be tied to a puzzle. So I think there's this challenge in Strangeland. We accomplish this, but to the extent it succeeds, I don't know. But the whole game is an act of introspection by the protagonist, and so the way the puzzles emerge in a sense psychologically rather than organically from his mental states, and the way you solve them is meant to be an expression of mentally working through a puzzle that's emerging from your psyche. And so we've sort of externalized what would otherwise be introspection. I don't know if it works, but you can't do that in every game, right? You can't make a game about, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example, but negotiating a peace treaty between two warring powers ultimately has to still be about finding the items and putting them together in some combination, because that's how
Mhm.
the genre works.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about the game. This was an adventure game. I think it was called The Siege of Calvary. It was like from the developer of Seven Little Things. Is that what it was called? I'll have to look that up. It was like a kind of like Monty Python esque kind of like puzzle solving design. Like the big weird thing about it was that the you could solve every puzzle legitimately, trying to figure out what wacky solution, or your character just pull out their sword and stab the person and kill them. And when that happens, like the Monty Python as God like just shows up and like strikes you with lightning, and it will like lead to like the bad ending or the weird ending if you just keep stabbing people. But it was like hilarious. Like I could go around and just like figure out this convoluted puzzle or stab, and I'll just take the item that way.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of like that. We have a little bit of that flavor. There's some puzzles that can be solved more sort of directly like that. Um, this is one thing I like about multiple puzzle solutions. There's a text adventure I
Mm-hmm.
often hold out as a good example of this called Metamorphoses by Emily Short.
Mm-hmm.
So you play like I don't know, sort of a spirit under the control of a wizard in this mist-like kind of environment, mist with a Y. And there are these puzzles. Puzzles have various solutions, but as you play it, like you're not even aware that there are multiple solutions, right? It doesn't project to you you could solve this way or that way. And it's quite easy to play the game in a destructive manner where you overcome obstacles by smashing things, and then that's reflected in the ending. By
Mm-hmm.
the way you've approached these puzzles, you've defined the character. It's not like BioWare, where you're sort of have like a green option and a red option, and the red option is going to make you look uglier, and at the end you'll torture someone, and the green option or blue option, whatever it is going to make you a good guy, and you'll have a halo or whatever at the end. It's much more subtle than that, but very effective, because when you replay it and suddenly realize there's like another path here. um, Again, there's that like epiphany moment of communing with the designer, um, where that to me is very much like real life. Sometimes we everything has different ways you can approach it. Sometimes we react in a violent way without thinking about other paths that you could take, and it's only in retrospect, you realize, geez, that wasn't the way I had to deal with the situation. And I think, she sort of constructed this game that does a very good job of reminding one that you don't, just because there's a glass statue, you don't have to smash it. You have a hammer, there's a glass statue, but smashing a glass statue isn't like, only when you're trapped in this adventure game mentality that because it can be done, it must be done, right? That's sort of
Exactly.
like the core adventure game mentality, that I actually think has not been adequately subverted by any game yet.
Hmm.
Um, I think in the fantasy setting, there have been interesting sort of efforts to subvert this. I think the Joe Abercrombie's First Law series is sort of a subversion of this, where because someone is the protagonist, you treat them as the hero, but they're
Hmm.
not necessarily the hero. In the same way, in an adventure game, it's like there is the sociopathic quality that we talked about earlier. That um, you know, if an adventure game permits you to rob from someone, right? You could have in an adventure game that you go into a hospital and there's a person in critical condition with medicine right next to them, like a drip, like an IV drip.
Hmm.
And you make the IV drip medicine a hotspot that permits the command to take the item, and a substantial percentage of players will take it merely because it can be taken, on the assumption that, again, because it can be done, it shall be done. The game will not punish me for taking an action that it permits. And then, if the patient dies or whatever, the player will get outraged, like, how dare you make me complicit in this crime? But like, this is sort of like, I think you could construct a whole game about someone who sort of is this anarchic or even destructive force, but internally thinks, he or she is the protagonist of the story because, I mean, you are the protagonist, you're the
Hmm.
focal point of the story. So everything that's there just exists for you to do with it as you will. Anyway,
Yeah.
uh, maybe such a game has been made and I'm unaware of it, but it seems like it would be an uh, interesting idea.
And but what you just said there about how if the player can do it, surely it must be done. I think that could definitely into talk about kind of like developer trust, or trusting the developer as to what you can and can't do in that space. But that's another thing that's not only indicative of adventure games, but just of a lot of games in general. That if the game lets me do it, surely there is some benefit. There's a reason to do this. And we've seen like wacky stories. I know there must be plenty of examples of adventure games where you must do every crazy, almost meaningless thing, but somehow it will, in a Rube Goldberg esque kind of story flow, it will save the day. You'll win the girl. You'll beat the game because you decide to flip a burger patty and throw it at a pigeon at one point in the level.
Right, right, right. And I mean, so for sure, there is like a lot of this by negative implication in adventure games, where like the failure to do something or doing something wrong results in a downstream Walking Dead scenario where, little do you know, you
Hmm.
ate the apple in scene 2 of the game, and now in scene 173, you needed that apple.
Hmm.
Kyrandia has that. They have 2 apples, so if you only eat one of them, you'll be okay. But like as a kid, it's like, well, it lets me eat the apple. Clearly, the apple core has to be usable for something.
Hmm.
And then, like way, way later in the game, I was supposed to give an apple to a fawn or something, and it's like SOL. That's it. But yeah, I mean, some of my fondest memories in games are precisely the moments in which a game permitted me to do something but didn't tell me I could do it.
Hmm.
Right? So, there's sort of like the bright light is over here, but there actually is like a room over here. So like Deus Ex, the fact that you can actually save your brother in that shootout, like,
Hmm.
is wild to me. Like when I played that the first time, like, I don't know, this is clearly one of those sequences where like the enemies are overpowered. If you
Hmm.
fight, you're gonna die. They didn't bother to, it's inevitable that if you go this route, it's gonna die, and you have to flee. And only later did I learn, no, like the game actually, like there is a whole other path where you could go this way. So that's one
Hmm.
that I missed. But there are games. Um, that account for it.
Mm-hmm.
On another project I have, so we've got this role playing game I've been working on for a decade, and my sort of key teammate on it and I have this term for a player. We call him the Siberian. The Siberian is someone who is stuck in like a research station or like a listening post in Siberia and has nothing to do other than play our game. And like, so we talk about things that are in the game for the Siberian, right? He's the only one who's going to ever come across this. He's the only one who's ever going to appreciate it. And but sometimes someone is always the Siberian. Many people are the Siberian in games. And when you have that experience, right? I tried something completely bonkers. I skipped this
Mm-hmm.
entire quest line, said no. The king asked me, "Will you marry my daughter?" I said no 7 times, and he finally accepted it. And then there was like another effort to get me back on track, and I
Mm-hmm.
said no again. And I just keep like fighting the game. And then suddenly the game is like, well, okay, you can actually fine. If this is the way you want to go, I'm going to roll with it. And that moment when that happens in the game is really great. I mean, it's hard to do them in adventure games because it's so design expensive to add
Mm-hmm.
in optional content. Um, but I think like Disco Elysium, that's a game that sort of like
Yes.
hovers between adventure game and role playing game. Has a lot of those. I mean, this is like a big part of the appeal of that game is there's like all of these crazy tangents you can get off on, and the game is sitting there waiting for you with content at the end of that tangent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my tangent.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Disco Elysium, was I was just about to bring that up as well, because yeah, like if we're talking about a game that just lets you, wander around and break stuff in the game, or just like do whatever the hell you want, that is certainly an example of it. Yeah, and there's certainly a lot that we've talked about, and we could certainly rant about examples until the cows come home. But I know, depending upon like how our schedules look, that you have to get going in a few minutes. I do want to at least spend a few minutes discussing more about Strangeland, and we'll see kind of like where the discussion goes after that. So we haven't really, we again, just like with adventure games, you can easily go on a crazy journey and get into a tangent filled adventure there. But for people listening to us, like, what is Strangeland? Like, what is kind of like the design? Like, what is someone going to experience in that game?
It is a fantastical, nightmarish carnival. That's what Strangeland is, a carnival, uh, in which a man awakens with no knowledge of how he got there and no particular knowledge of who he is. I wouldn't say he's an amnesiac. This is more like in a dream, your identity is not particularly important. The things that, it's sort of like what's happening is what matters. So he enters this carnival and he sees a woman throw herself down a well. And an animatronic fortune telling head comes to life when it turns on and tells him that the woman is dead but not gone, and that the woman and the protagonist are both trying to save each other, and it's who will save whom. And then the animatronic fortune teller turns off and you're off to the races. So it's a horror game. I would say more in the vein of Ray Bradbury than in the vein of Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
But there is some grotesque imagery, so it's maybe halfway between the two of them. Bradbury is like a classic teller of dark carnival tales, so there's like a lot of that dimension to it. Um, it's not so uh, it is an imagined setting. So this is not a spoiler. I think it will be obvious the second someone starts the game. This is not a real carnival. You are not, a traveler who's been in a car accident and staggers into a real carnival that has nightmarish creatures in it. This is a you know hallucination, a vision, a dream, a nightmare, something like that. Um, and the inhabitants of the carnival, the puzzles of the carnival, the geography of the carnival are a reflection of this mental anguish that the protagonist is going through. So solving the puzzles, solving the game, is really about working through the the mental state of the protagonist. Um, we've, you know, and then I guess the other thing I would say is that um, it's a very thematic game. So it has, I don't know, or symbolic. I don't know what the right word is, but there's a lot of references to, you know, I don't know, psychology to literature to video games, all sorts of
Mm-hmm.
things. So there's like this, interwoven references. Um, but what we've tried to do, I don't think it should be thought of as like an art game. Like to me, it is a game. It will play, you, you have the traditional adventure game gameplay. You have inventory puzzles, you have user interface puzzles, you have dialogues, you have some mini games, all the things that one would expect in an adventure game. There is a story, right? It's not just like images detached from a story. There is a narrative, there's a protagonist, there's an antagonist. There are, people you meet along the way who help you. There are people you meet along the way who hinder you. Um, and but at the same time, there is, I think, a rich subtext. I mean, it's odd to use a complimentary term for one's own work, but one thing that a lot of people have said they liked about Primordia was the sense that there was a subtext to it, and I think that's true here as well. Um, and then it has puzzles, as we talked about, it has a lot of puzzles in it, and they have multiple solutions. Those solutions, um, because the puzzles are themselves representative of mental states, right? The solutions represent different mental processes for working through them, whether you come at something directly, whether you sort of deny it, whether you unravel it, whether you cut through the knot. So anyway, that's a quick version.
And going back to something you said earlier about like kind of like the horror side of this, I mean, this is another like potential like hour long discussion we could have right here. But for like old school adventure game developers or fans, there were a lot of very mature like horror infused adventure games back in the 90s. Phantasmagoria, Sanitarium. There was another one that was like you could like walk around this town and like murder people. I forget the name of it. And I guess for Strangeland, as you said earlier, it's not like pure horror. Like for people listening to us like right now, like I guess without spoiling things, how I guess mature is Strangeland going to be for somebody? If you could, answer that.
So one answer is that I would not play it with my kids. My kids are 11 and 9, and I would not play this game. The other kids maybe that age would enjoy it, but I think it would be a little bit too scary for them. It's not scary. So there are different kinds of horror, right? There's like
Mm-hmm.
torture horror. There's like slasher
Psychological.
horror,
Yeah.
right? This has a mix. So I would say there's like imagery, sort of like Buñuel, the filmmaker who has like the disturbing imagery in his short films. I can't. Now I'm blanking on it. I would say it's sort of like more like a surrealist horror imagery, but not this is not you're shackled and have to saw off your hand with a hacksaw kind of horror. But nevertheless, sufficiently grotesque imagery that I probably would not let a child see it. But there's no, there is not the like slasher horror, torture horror, because it's all mental. No one is going to get killed because no one is real, right? It's a mental construct. Then now the mental constructs get destroyed. They get killed in that sense, but not in like some super gory way. I don't know. I would say it's like PG-13, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, is my shorthand.
And I was looking at the store page and some of the art on the site. It looks very unique and amazing. Like, what kind of like aesthetic like were you and the team like going for with Strangeland in terms of like the look of it?
Well, so I would say this is like for the artist Vic's position. I actually, so initially when we were discussing making this game as a 3-week, 2-week competition game, the image I had in my mind was like the Gothic castle in Gormenghast, the Mervyn Peake novels. Um, and then Vic had the idea of doing it in a carnival. So I would say the visuals really flow from Vic's imagination. I think he has uh, uh, like a sense of like organic. Everything is organic. The machines are organic. Everything he does is organic. Um, and then like a sense of decay, like in all of his works. So whether it's a decaying robot or a decaying carnival or whatever. Um, but in terms of like my descriptions to him, that there would be a sense of vulnerability to the world that you're in. That these because I view this as sort of like whatever the mental equivalent of a mouth in which you have a lot of like sore gums and teeth, right? So you don't really want to be poking at things because it's going to elicit a reaction that you might not want. This is a protagonist who is trying to avoid grappling with some grief in his life. And uh, so you want there to be a sense of like repugnance and anxiety about engaging with the characters that you're meeting. Um, but because not all the characters are antagonists. In fact, most of the characters are, they're not the most helpful, but they are not antagonists. They're basically helpers along the way. You don't want them to be too off-putting because then the player will just view them as adversarial. So there's like this sense of like um, of weakness or vulnerability, but also grotesqueness to these characters.
And I guess like speaking about this kind of world, like there's one other point about adventure game design that we didn't touch on. I think this may actually be too big for the time that we have, but like in relation to Strangeland, one of the more polarizing aspects has always been, we kind of brought this up about fail states. You didn't pick up the apple and give it to the witch, and the witch, 10 hours later decides to curse you and turn you into a frog at the end, or the infamous from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where if you didn't pick up the towel in like the first 5 minutes of play, 10 hours later, you're going to lose. With Strangeland, are there like, do you have any like fail states? Like, is there a way for the player to lose?
No. So, and I would say in Primordia, so Primordia also had no fail states. You could always complete the game, you could never die. But there was one point in Primordia where um, how you handled a puzzle actually had a pretty significant impact way down the line in a way that I think most players reacted negatively to. So this doesn't have that. The puzzle solutions do have an effect down the line, but I would say there's much less clearly like a correct path and an incorrect path. It's much more to give an example, there's like the animatronic fortune teller. You eventually are able to, you get quarters, you can operate the fortune teller, and you can get 3 fortunes told: your past, your present, and your future. And the way that works is that the fortune teller will ask you which tarot card should represent something in your life at that time. So we'll say, what card do you pick to represent yourself in the past? And gives you 3 choices. And then we'll say, what card do you pick to represent the woman in the past, whatever they are, right? And there's 3 choices for each time period. So that means there's 9 combinations for each of the 3 time periods. So there are, I guess, 27 different. Maybe actually as you multiply it out, it gets bigger. But there's all sorts of different ways you can describe that, and how you articulate your own conception of your past, present, and future affects dialogue in the game, interactions in the game, a puzzle in the game. But it's not like if you answer, the fool versus the hanged man, you get more content or less content, or you get to win the game in the end versus lose the game in the end. It's much more um, like in the Metamorphoses game I mentioned by Emily Short. It's much more like you're shaping um, your own understanding of the character and how that's expressed in the game, and much less like a fail state or a good path, bad path.
And I think there's so much like we've talked about. There's so much more we haven't talked about. I'm trying to resist it because I know you have a business meeting. I won't make you late for your next meeting here, but there's definitely that polarizing thoughts about very divergent paths when it comes to anything that's story driven. I think there's that polarization that if I do X, I miss out on all of this. But if I do Y, I miss out on all of this. And I think part of it is also the idea of just like how much time we have to play games these days. Like you don't have the time to replay the same game 8 times to get 8 different endings. Maybe back in the 90s, and like I've bemoaned the fact that despite covering video games for a living, I think I play less video games now than I did 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, look, from a designer standpoint, alternative paths are really expensive and you don't get a lot of bang for your buck, right? So if you make 8 paths and each player only does one, then you've given that player a much shorter path. 7 of the 8 paths were worthless as to that player. So to me, but then, I'll take an example. There's a role-playing game called The Age of Decadence. Really fantastic multi-path,
Mm-hmm.
multi-solution role-playing game. And so what is it that I liked? What made me respond so favorably to The Age of Decadence when I have the exact experience you did? I did not replay that game, so it just meant I missed out on a ton of content.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the answer is that as a player, to have the game basically say, I hear you, I understand the choice you're making, and I obey, right? Or I validate. You chose to be a smooth talking thief. Validated. Now, this interaction shows those attributes that you gave your character these attributes, and now I, the game, am going to recognize that that was your choice, and I acknowledge it and respect it. That to me is like, it's really cool as a player, right? It makes me feel like I am an author of the story and not just the reader of the story. It doesn't have to be multi paths. I think the most shameless, I beat up on BioWare sometimes on this, but I feel like BioWare is very shameless in this regard, where you will have what is nominally a choice, seemingly a dramatic choice, right? Like nuke the city, don't nuke the city. It's like, that seems like a big choice. But then it turns out, okay, you don't nuke the city, the terrorists have nuked the city anyway. And so you're back on the exact same path, only you got Paragon points rather than Renegade points or whatever.
Yeah,
and like,
okay.
but that if you do that artfully, you can achieve the sort of acknowledgement of the player's choices in a way that feels real to the player without having to have two completely divergent games, right? One in which the city was destroyed and one in which it was not destroyed. And I think, I don't know. To me, I get a lot as a player out of, like, again, Disco Elysium is a great example of this, right? I haven't replayed that, but just feeling like my character, my choices, the game was laughing at the jokes I constructed, right? The game was cheering for the power moves that I carried out, or making a burlesque of the failed power moves I attempted, whatever it is. That to me is like, that's the core of the player experience. It happens all the time in games without narratives, right? Street Fighter 2 has these epic moments where you win a fight with just a sliver of life, in some preposterous way, or you lose a fight in some dramatic way. And, but with a narrative, it can only be done by these choices and consequences, or choices and, tonal shifts. So we've tried to do that without having fail states, without having, loser paths, but trying to make it feel like, the story that you are telling, the understanding that you're developing is ratified by the game. So it's your story, not just our story.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about the game Infamous that had like this situation where you have to either do you save your wife or do you save innocent people, and no matter what choice you decide, the wife still dies. Like it was like, oh, that's great. My choice really mattered there.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's hard. It's hard because you want the choice to be a big choice, but most big choices carry big consequences, and then you're like, I don't know, how am I going to make this narrative work with the wife still alive, right? If you're sort of thinking, I wrote this great story. I don't know. Everyone's gone through this when you're like when I was a kid and used to do D&D, right? I'd be a dungeon master, and there's nothing more frustrating than like I have this great story idea, and the players just don't want to go along with it. It's like they've got to go off in some new direction and come up with some new story. And as a game designer, you have that feeling too, right? You've got, there's something in you that needs to be expressed, and so you have to figure out how can I express this in the way that it means something to me, but also in a way that allows the player to infuse her or his own meaning into it. And I hope we've struck that balance with Strangeland. You sort of don't know until it's out there, and then you see how people react.
Mm-hmm. I know that we are just about right at time for this discussion. Like we were saying earlier, Mark, if you are free, we can certainly have a part 2 or even a part 3 discussion on adventure game design, because I always love having these conversations.
Well, that would be great. I look forward to it, and let's circle up. I'll shoot you an email after a break from my other meeting.
All right, so to wrap things up for our discussion today, for people listening, when is Strangeland due out?
May 25th, and it will be on Steam and Good Old Games.
All right. And do you have any social media you would like to plug? Twitter, Facebook, whatever.
Yeah, we have Twitter and Facebook. I can't. Twitter is WWS for Wormwood Studios Games, so WWS Games, and Facebook I think is just Wormwood Studios.
All right. And for those of you listening, I don't think this will be the end of our discussion with Mark. I'm sure we are going to be talking a lot in the future, because again, there's still so much about adventure game design that we can bring up. And Mark, thank you so much for coming on, and best of luck with Strangeland's release.
Thank you very much for hosting, and I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
All right. So thank you so much to Mark if he's watching this recorded. If you are new, check out our Patreon and Discord link down below. And if you are a developer working on your own game and would like to come on for a discussion, please get in touch. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom.